Thank you, everyone. It's always good to see kind of how people fit on this journey. And I mean, great to see that nobody's doing nothing. That's always promising. And I think what's really exciting about this is that, there's not really a mandatory expectation for private or listed companies to reach net zero just yet. We'll come on to that later. So the fact there's already such a strong intention, or, you're already starting the journey is great to see. So that's 10 people have answered. Looks like 4 are intending to do something and hopefully here to learn a bit more about how. 3 already on the journey and feel kind of capable, and then 3 actively decarbonising already. So that's brilliant, a great mix, and hopefully you can learn from one another today. So let me just start with a bit of the basics, because this is terminology that gets used all the time, but we find is not consistently understood. So let's debunk net zero. The term was actually coined in the Paris Agreement in 2015 and has quickly been adopted from science into policy. It was in 2018 that the timeline and need for reaching net zero was spelt out more clearly. And the UN Climate Science Panel declared that global carbon dioxide emissions must fall by 45% by 2030 and to net zero by 2050 in order for the world to have a chance of avoiding devastating and irreversible consequences in which we go past the 1.5 degree temperature threshold. So in short, what that means is that as a globe, as organizations, as countries, we need to reach net zero emissions by 2050, which is a 90% reduction on today's CO2 emissions, with the remaining and unavoidable 10% being permanently removed through carbon removal projects. Pretty audacious goal, but one that we cannot ignore anymore. And so the question on everyone's mind is, how on earth do we get there? Fear not. I think companies of all sizes and governments are grappling with this question. But what is clear is that the first step, if you're going to set the goal of reducing emissions by 90%, is to understand what your emissions are today. So baselining your emissions is a requirement that we try and push onto our companies, onto our customers to do as soon as possible, because the sooner we begin, the higher our chances of reaching this goal. No doubt you all are aware that every business has a carbon footprint, and our goal at Trace is to empower those companies to start their journey to net zero today by helping you measure, manage and track your emissions over time through our simple technology platform and team of sustainability experts to support. As the old adage goes, what you can measure, you can manage. So by understanding where your emissions come from, you can identify and start to implement initiatives to reduce them. As an example, if you're a large electricity consumer, you might consider switching to renewables. If you travel a lot, you might consider greener forms of transportation or less transportation at all. And if you have a large supply chain, you'd probably want to start considering engaging your suppliers to understand their policies on carbon reduction. So again, what you can measure, you can manage, and we would encourage you to start that journey as soon as possible. So having worked with hundreds of small and mid-cap companies at Trace, we found, interestingly, that about 25% of carbon emissions are actually directly attributable to employees. So broadly speaking, that means their commuting behavior and the electricity they use from working from home, which has obviously increased a lot in the last few years. But it's important to remember that what they don't control directly, they certainly influence by their choice of travel or their choice of suppliers. So what's clear to us is that companies won't succeed in reaching net zero if they don't engage their stakeholders, namely their employees and their suppliers. But unfortunately, if you look through public disclosures of net zero targets, only about 10% of them actually include employees and suppliers in those targets. So there's a big gap for us to fill there. The other point to note is that it's a big missed opportunity if you don't engage your staff, because we know that about 70% of employees in Australia, according to a recent survey by Atlassian, want to work for companies that have a climate action plan. So involving them not only actually helps you unlock decarbonisation, but it's a great way to both attract and retain great talent in our young and climate aware workforce today. So this is why employee education and engagement is a really big focus for us at Trace. Keen to understand from this group, because it does tend to vary a little bit depending on of industry and client, the type of company. How important is climate action to your employees, do you think? 1 being not, 5 being very. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that's good to see. We certainly, most of the conversations we have with our customers say that they're either engaging us because their clients are asking what the policies are around decarbonisation, but probably the biggest driver is staff going, what's our plan? What are we doing? So that's interesting that about half of you think that climate is very important to your staff, and then the rest around the 3 and 4 mark. Fascinating. That's great. Well, that's something that I really hope that you take away from today, is that involving your employees on this journey is not only an opportunity for engaging your staff, but it actually will help you unlock decarbonisation opportunities as well, given they directly control 25% of emissions. So we're here today, as you know, to talk about particularly ASX-listed companies, some of which you might be working for or interested in. So I think it's important just to cover off what the legislative landscape looks like. So what are the actual sustainability reporting obligations in Australia today? Now, the short answer, and you might be surprised to learn, is that there's actually very little mandatory requirement today, but that is changing very, very fast. So just to name the regulatory bodies that are acting and impacting Australian companies today. First of all, the Australian government's Clean Energy Regulator. They have a national greenhouse gas reporting scheme, which mandates that extremely high emitting companies must report their scope 1 and 2. So that's gas, fuel and electricity emissions. But to be honest, this is really only impacts the energy generators, the mining firms and the large manufacturing facilities, so those really high emitters. The TCFD, which you may have heard of, stands for the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and it's a global framework to help public companies and other organizations disclose climate-related risks and opportunities. It's a voluntary standard, but interestingly, in 2021, Australia actually had the 4th largest number of disclosures in the world, showing that there is actually a big demand from investors and companies to start disclosing climate-related risks. So that may well get adopted more broadly. Now, if you've been watching any of the news lately regarding sustainability reporting, you may have heard of what's known as the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which has been launched by the IFRS. It is an international gold standard for investor-focused sustainability reporting, which includes climate, particularly including requirements for scopes 1, 2, and eventually 3, which is your supply chain. Now, these standards are not yet integrated into Australian law, but the Treasury has initiated a consultation process, which is moving at record speeds and has had an incredible amount of responses to, which shows the pressure for standardized sustainability, in particular climate reporting. So I guess to summarize, very few companies in Australia, either public or private today, are mandated to report their emissions, but we expect this to come into effect for listed companies in probably less than 12 months. So time to get your house in order, which is a great segue into our Q&A with Natalie. Thanks so much for joining us. I'd love to start off, Natalie, just high level, working in both an ESG consulting company and also as the managing director of ESG in an ASX listed company. What does ESG actually mean to your business?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think what's starting to converge a little bit is the fact that whether you're ASX listed or not, as these things are starting to converge on one another. But I think, when you think about being a listed business and obviously the governance of running a business and how you approach ESG, I think comes with some risk, obviously, and how do we mitigate that risk moving forward? And, besides the point that it will become compulsory, as you just covered off, for ASX listed businesses to report on their footprint, I think we also know that, we live in a trust economy. And when I talk about a trust economy, think about, 10 years ago, no one knew what Uber was. I mean, the idea of getting into a stranger's car and just going somewhere and paying them money seemed ridiculous, right? Or this idea that you would just start to, share things. So like, I've got something, you need it, you can borrow it. Think about car next door, an amazing sharing economy business. And that sharing economy built this trust economy. And I think that now, we live in and we operate in glass houses. We used to work for corporations where no one could see in. The market knew only what you wanted them to know. Whereas now the market really has much deeper insights. You have to disclose a lot more, even when you're employing people. I don't know if anybody's ever encountered Glassdoor, for example. And so people often come to an interview and they're like, well, your rating's pretty average on Glassdoor because, your last 50 employees only rated you a 2 out of 5. And so people are coming to the table with a lot more insight. And so I think especially for ASX listed companies where trust is key and governance is so critical, ESG is just the next reiteration of being responsible corporate citizens and really being honest and transparent about how you do business. And it's those companies that are already seeing the benefits and really driving ahead of their competition. And all that really means is better shareholder value.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I love that link to trust. And I think all of the research from employees and investors shows that disclosing and being open about climate and sustainability risk and opportunities builds that trust. So that's a great
100%.
analogy.
And actually, on that note, there is a survey that we follow really, really closely. It gets done on the NASDAQ every 3 years. They redo this survey. And the survey measures performance of responsible businesses and those with a very strong ESG versus those that are box ticking, essentially. And just before COVID, they released results, and companies that have strong ESG and are trusted on their ESG strategy outperform their competitors by 123%.
Wow.
They just re-released the same report in December, and that has increased to 134%. And our projections are that will exceed 200% within the next 5 to 7 years. That's not a coincidence. That's 15 years of outperformance. And, all again, shareholder value, client value, employee value.
That's so great to hear. And I think that kind of links into my next question. And, the question is broadly like, what are the key drivers for a listed company to start planning for net zero? But I'd also love to hear that from the context of Prime and what the drivers were for you at Prime Finance.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for Prime, Prime really saw the, the opportunity in a big growth phase of also the responsibility to become good corporate citizens. And while we don't have huge scope 3, because obviously we don't manufacture anything, we don't own the buildings that we operate out of, we have the potential from an ESG investment perspective and also from a social impact perspective and how we can really create positive outcome. And, we talk about, and, our call to action really is aspire, innovate, grow, and impact. And so we want to help individuals reach their aspirations. And that is everybody. It's our employees, it's our customers, it's the communities in which we operate in, and it's society at large. And for us, it was really important that we become good corporate citizens as part of our strategy moving forward. And I think from a driver's perspective, we also know, and if you think about it really from a critical business perspective, you want to attract and retain the best talent in the industry. And as I mentioned before, people are coming to the table to interviews, and you want your values to align to the company you want to work for, or that you're gunning to work for. And if those values don't align, people are walking away. And again, there's a really good Deloitte study that was done a couple of years ago, and they showed that millennials and Gen Zs will actually take an up to 20% pay cut to work for a company that they feel that their values are aligned to, versus one that they are not. The other really interesting stat, I think, is that 69% of that same two generations are making very, very, targeted decisions around their superannuation. Now, I don't know. At 22, I really wasn't focused on my superannuation personally. But I think the fact that you're seeing now people really saying, well, actually, I care where my money's going. I care where my investments are going. I care what's going to happen to the planet. So from an employee perspective, you can't attract and retain the best talent in the industry. And we know that. So that's, a huge element. The second thing is your clients. Clients want to be associated with businesses that are good businesses. Ultimately, you don't want to wear a brand that is into modern slavery, as an example. You don't want to be aligned to a brand that is, doing terrible things and is not working towards a better future. And clients, again, are making decisions with their wallets. And it's been shown time and time again that clients will pay a premium to buy a sustainable, water bottle versus one that isn't, as an example.
Yeah.
So customers are also really pushing, the dial. And I think the other piece is shareholders. Yeah. Shareholders can see the value in transparent, honest, truthful businesses. And that's really, the three key drivers that we see from organisations of, and it's not just net zero, it's about actually, I think, all of ESG. It's about becoming responsible businesses, both environmentally and socially.
Yeah, fascinated. Thank you, Natalie. Those are great examples. I think that what we're seeing as well, particularly when it comes to net zero, is that the more companies are setting targets to reach net zero, the more it's actually affecting their supply chain. So, if you're Coles or if you're a large bank and you've said we are going to be net zero by 2050, and that includes our supply chain, inevitably it means anyone servicing those companies as a supplier are going to eventually need to come to the party. Otherwise, they're creating emissions for that company. So there's a really powerful impact of the top setting targets. But equally, I think there's a real opportunity for the smaller businesses to take the lead and really lead by example.
Yeah, and I think it's where also small businesses are just starting on this journey and are doing it really well, will win, because some of the larger businesses, it's much harder for them to go through this process. And so if you can start with that mindset, and, we've worked with a number of startups as well, where you've got that benefit of starting with a semi-clean slate. So it's far less arduous to undo all, everything that you've been doing for years and years and years, even though you have the right intent. But it's those companies that are winning. Yeah. Because as you said, I think in scope 3, if 30% of your suppliers are already net zero, it costs you a lot less to become net zero.
Right.
So ultimately, you want to work with businesses that are close to or at net zero in your supply chain, because all that does is reduce your costs.
Love that. That's an excellent point. And then just taking a slightly more personal note, if I can, Natalie, why is it important to you as an industry leader to be thinking about measuring, managing, and influencing decarbonisation?
Look, I think we all want to leave a legacy of sorts, I think. And I personally want to leave a legacy of change and a legacy that inspires people into action. And I think you said a statement at the beginning when you introduced me, Kat, that I've been, harping on about for probably 7 or 8 years now, but this idea that purpose drives people build communities, and communities change the world. And I really feel that businesses are the most powerful communities to help change the world and to achieve, net zero targets, and also to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which we really closely align ourselves to. And in fact, Prime has become a signatory of the UN Global Compact. Right. And that is really for everybody who has come across them, to end poverty in all its forms by 2030. And for me, measuring, managing and influencing emissions reduction is a critical first step in leading the charge and building legacy.
That's amazing. That's so true. I love the word legacy. But obviously it doesn't happen overnight, as I'm sure hopefully you took away in my introduction, that getting a 90% reduction in emissions is a pretty aggressive goal for anyone. So obviously we need to chunk this down and try and make it practical, recognizing that most people have other responsibilities at work as well. So in your experience, what are the first practical steps to planning for reduced emissions, and what did you do at Prime?
Yeah, I think the first step is really a materiality survey. And I think it doesn't have to be hugely and overly complicated. You don't want to walk away with a 700-page document, but that materiality first step to really understand, and we really look at 6 key stakeholder groups when we do our materiality surveys. And we look at employees, we look at customers, supply chains, the communities in which organisations work, shareholders, and key stakeholders of management. And really it's understanding what are those key drivers, because I think what we think sometimes when we're sitting in a leader's chair versus when we're sitting in a partner or supplier or an employee chair is very different to where we think we're creating impact and what's important and what we do as an organisation. So we actually take a really holistic view as a first step to really understand where we need to focus on and where we've got some wins, actually, because I think a lot of organisations have those moments of realisation, we actually do a little bit of work here, we just don't really talk about it, we don't consolidate our results, and we don't really think about that as part of ESG. But post that, that scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions, I feel is really critical, because if you don't have a baseline, and I think, Kat, you said it well, if it can be measured, it can be dealt with, but, you can't do anything if you don't have a baseline. And the one thing I would really recommend, where there are companies that don't have a huge supply chain, to do all of your scope 3 emissions, but at the very minimum, engage your employees, because the employee footprint makes up part of those scope 3. And that scope 3 is a really good way, that employee footprint is part of scope 3. And we did this at Prime. We actually did our employee footprint before we calculated the rest of scope 3, because we wanted them to come on the journey from the beginning. And I think that bringing people and the closest circle to you, and ultimately none of us can run a business without our people. Our people are what makes the cogs turn. And so, I feel that bringing your people on that journey right at the beginning is the most critical part, and then over communicating. I just really believe closing the loop. Every time you do something, close the loop, over communicate it, because most people, it's not our day-to-day job for a lot of people, right? So you need to over-communicate the why, the how, the what, and next steps.
Love that. You mentioned when you kind of did that materiality assessment, it uncovered, there's some hot spots, but also some pleasant surprises. Are you happy to share any of those?
Yeah, I think that for us, we, our approach to, we have to move to, so we've just moved in Sydney, and we also are moving our Brisbane office just because our leases were up. And there was already this approach to cleaner procurement. So what buildings are we going into? How are we going to reduce our footprint by going into greener buildings? So there was a big piece already that was in place around that it hadn't been spoken about. I think the other big piece for us that we uncovered is gender equality within the organisation and pay parity. And because we have not had to report on that until this coming financial year, we'll have to start reporting based on our size. But when we looked at it, we're like, we actually have gender equality at senior level, across all senior levels of the organisation. And we have pay parity. And that's, I think for us, was a massive win in the ESG space. Yeah. And we had a few other small wins along the way that we unfolded, especially around our employee value proposition. So when we consolidated everything that we do, we realised we have a fairly powerful EVP.
That's fantastic to hear. And, sorry to bring it back to climate, just because that's, net zero is something I'm very passionate about. But what we've seen quite a lot of in the, reported about in the news lately is, you've obviously all heard about greenwashing. There's now a term called green hushing, which is the phenomenon of companies actually not celebrating or disclosing their impact, positive impact, for fear of being accused of greenwashing, which in my view is really sad, because if companies should get credit for the effort, that the voluntary effort and impact they're having, and to not share it means you're not reaping the rewards as you should of employee engagement, customer loyalty, that kind of thing. So from doing your baseline and going through that process, have you as a company felt more confident talking about your impact?
Yeah, and look, we're going to release our sustainability statement for the first time with our results in the next sort of 6 to 8 weeks. But it is a real problem, and I think it's a real shame. But I also, and we do when we work with our customers, we really talk about this idea that it's not about going from zero to hero overnight. It is about creating a roadmap, because ultimately you're not in the business of net zero. You're in the business of whatever business you're in, right? We're in the business of capital advice and asset management, but it's how do you apply that ESG lens to your business strategy, so that moving forward, you can make decisions that have positive environmental and social impact on the world. And I think, again, going back to that closing the loop, I think that, and going back to trust and that trust economy, that I don't think anybody expects you to never, ever mess up or to never get it wrong. But it's how you close the loop on where you've come short or where you haven't been able to achieve the targets, and really being open about why that's happened. And, we used to have a term that we used to use in my previous roles where we refer to it as fail forward. So actually talk about what's gone wrong, fix the problem, fix the chink in the chain, explain how you fix a chink in the chain, and then move forward. And I think, there's huge risk, and, there's the large, the ASX 100, like there's a huge amount of risk associated with it. But I do agree with you, Kat, this idea that companies are now green hushing is terrible, because also we can't learn from each other. They're not reaping the value that they're creating, and they should. The more money a company makes, the more impact they can create. Yeah,
that's a great point.
Yeah, and so, but I think that what hasn't happened in the past is there hasn't been transparency around the shortcomings and the why and how they've been fixed. And so it's like Net Promoter Score, basic customer feedback, just close the loop, close the loop, close the loop every single time. And I think the companies that do that well also reap the benefits. And, I think it's like if you don't answer a customer complaint, you're going to lose a customer forever. If you answer it, fix a problem, you'll probably keep them as an advocate for life.
Oh, that's such a good point. Amazing. Well, thank you. And I guess just to close off before I hand over to the audience to ask some questions, is there sort of one piece of advice you would give to businesses that are just starting out on their sustainability journey?
Yes, I would say get people around the boardroom table, start the conversation. It's not just about, you know, the executive sitting around the table. Get the voice of your people, your customers, your supply chain. Get, you know, people like Trace, people, you know, that have been working with other businesses around the table to start the conversation, because the more voices you give to the people you operate with and the people you want to sell to, the more powerful this will become for you. But my biggest thing is just start, because you'll be amazed the minute you start this conversation, how much you get back and how much trust starts to build by simply having this conversation. So just start. So, you know, the diet doesn't start on Monday, the diet starts today.
Oh, that's a great analogy to finish with. Thank you, Natalie. And also thank you to David on the chat for sharing the Future Focus Authenticity Advantage report. I've read that, and it's really interesting. It's worth a read, and it's very aligned to what Natalie was saying about you know, companies tend to perform better if they can prove they've got strong ESG. This is similarly, if your company aligns on what it's committing to in terms of ESG, communicates that clearly, and has a culture that is all aligned, you actually have better performance as a business. So definitely worth a read. Thank you for sharing that, David.
Kat and Nat, we have 3 questions across the chat as well as Slido. I might start with David's question in our Google Meets chat here. And just to those who joined a little bit later, there is a Slido app which we use for all of our interactive webinars. If you just choose the QR code here using your camera on your mobile device, you'll find your way into our live Q&A. So the first question for Kat and Nat from David is to talk briefly about our methods for Scope 3 carbon measurement.
Yes, great question. I'll take that, but Natalie, if you have anything to add, that'd be amazing. Scope 3, for anyone who's not familiar with that term, is all your indirect emissions associated with your supply chain, and there's lots of categories. The GHG protocol, which is the global best practice standard, has 15 categories ranging from your investment portfolio, your purchased goods and services, your employee commuting, any franchises. So it's really everything that you can influence but not directly control, and therefore it is harder to measure because it's not data that you normally you don't normally have direct access to emissions data from that supply chain. So there are a few different ways to that we at Trace help measure that. The fastest is using spend-based analysis. So it's very common to use, particularly for purchased goods and services. Let's say you're acquiring accounting services, you're buying catering services, you're buying food and goods or textiles for your company. The quickest and still very accurate way to understand kind of broadly the materiality of those emissions is using how much you're spending on that industry and applying what's known as an input-output emissions factor, which we have a large database of. That's accurate and fast, but it's not going to be quite as detailed as if you can get data directly from your suppliers. So even better if you can come to us and say, well, we have quite a large distribution footprint, so we do a lot of freight, and you can actually tell us how many kilometers of freight you're purchasing from your freight forwarding companies, and then we can use that activity to calculate. So I guess in short, there's always a few different ways we can do it depending on data availability, activity data if possible. If not, spend is a very, very good proxy. Thank you, David.
Awesome. I think the next question is for Nat. I've just put up the Slido Q&A on the screen so that everybody has a live view of the question. How did you allocate budget for the net zero project at Prime? Was it in the CSR budget?
Good question. And no, we actually allocated an ESG budget for Prime because our strategy hurdles multiple areas, including CSR. So the CSR budget is now making up part of our impact essentially, because we also, and it is a really good point, we went through a really big process as well of once we decided on our strategy and once we aligned ourselves to the UN Sustainable Development Goals that we can create impact and that we're in line with the business that we're in, we then looked at our charities that we are supporting and we aligned that as well. So we wanted to ensure that all of our activities are, intersect one another and create the most impact that they can create, and so that our people could really also get behind the entire strategy, including the CSR strategy.
I think if I can add a little bit to that, Natalie, and obviously you've been on the inside, but from my perspective, working with clients, the slight challenge with allocating a budget is you sort of don't know exactly how much it's going to cost you until you've done that baselining. So that's a piece that's worth investing some time in up front, because then you can understand, well, how big are my emissions? Where are they coming from? And what proportion of those emissions do we realistically think we can influence, which can then inform a discussion around the budget over the next 10, 20 years to actually achieve those goals. Yeah, definitely starting with let's find out the size of the problem first is normally the best way to get that initial budget unlocked, and then you can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think quantifying cost and quantifying climate action is a really good segue into the next question we have here for Kat. You mentioned a carbon baseline or a credible carbon baseline. How would a small or medium-sized enterprise start measuring or baselining themselves?
Yeah, certainly. Look, it is possible to do it yourself using a lot of publicly available sources. The challenge generally for most companies in doing that is understanding where to find the sources of emissions factors and what data they need to gather. So that's where we really like to help companies do that. The place I would start is always looking at your fuel and electricity consumption. Those are the two parts of emissions that are most directly controlled by most companies. So you hopefully will have some reporting on that and can actually look online for most governments publicize the emissions factors associated with their electricity grids. So that's something you can do yourself. Scope 3 is a lot harder to baseline, as I kind of alluded to before. So that's where partnering with a company like Trace, or there's some consultancies out there, can really help you get confidence that you're gathering, firstly, the right data, and that you're applying the most up-to-date emissions factors to get that calculation done.
Awesome. Thanks, I might jump to Anil's question because it correlates with your points there around scope 3. How does one account for a supplier like AWS, Amazon Web Services, so cloud hosting capabilities, as this is the place where many tech businesses, but also businesses of all shapes and sizes, run either their application workloads or their data security? How do we account for suppliers like these huge giants?
Yeah, great question. I'd say 95% of our clients use either AWS or Google Cloud, so that does form quite a big part of their scope 3 emissions. The simple answer is it falls into the category purchased goods and services. And the great thing about AWS is they do actually have a carbon tracker in their portal. I can't remember exactly where you find it, but log into your AWS account and there's actually a carbon emissions section which will show your utilization and the carbon associated with that. So that's actually a number that you can give us at Trace, and we will add that into your full carbon assessment so that we have included for that. If you don't use a supplier that publicizes carbon emissions, again, this is where using your spend with those suppliers is a really strong proxy to give you a sense of the scale of emissions.
Amazing. And for the last 60 seconds that we have left, we've got one final question here, which I think both Kat and Nat have both experience and subject matter expertise in. What are the ways we can communicate our climate action to clients? And I think, Nat, broadening that out to your collaborative approach that you were talking about earlier, how do you engage your ecosystem of stakeholders, both within and outside of office walls?
Yeah, I think that, there's multiple ways, and I think there's also multiple stages in which you want to communicate. And I think that there is that communication around, we've made a commitment, we've taken the first step, then, you know, some of the actions that you're taking. But again, for us, it's very much about bringing our customers and our, you know, our team members into the conversation. And for us, that's, you know, through more formal channels, whether that's, you know, conversations, meet face-to-face EDMs, LinkedIn, you know, editorial content that we've been asked to now speak about, and then being very overtly about, you know, we've achieved, you know, like for us, it's about, you know, we've achieved measurement of scope 1, 2, and 3. So we are now certified by Trace as we have measured all of our carbon footprint. The next stage for us will be to announce, well, what's going to be our strategy for reduction, because we really believe in reduction, not just buying the credits to become carbon neutral, but really a strategy about around reduction, and then the difference is what we'll need to obviously offset. But I say be open. It's like the closing the loop. I think there's be comfortable with what you're saying, so you have all the detail, but be really open, because the more transparent you are, the more trust you build. And in a world of a trust economy, it's one of the most sought after, you know, values that you can have in an organization.
Yeah, I echo that. I think just being open about the steps you have taken and the steps you plan to take is the best way to be authentic. It's not about trying to make it sound better than it is. You know, just say, we believe in sustainability. This is why we care. So step 1 is we've measured our baseline. Here are the things we're looking at. We will report back again next year. You know, it's not, just be transparent that you're on the journey, because nobody expects you to reach net zero tomorrow. We know it's a long journey. So I think that transparency piece is the most important part around building trust, as Natalie said.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then for those who want to stay around, I think Helene's question here at the bottom is really valuable, just to turn some of these really awesome insights into a practical timeline for businesses. So once a carbon baseline has been established, how do you determine what a net zero timeline looks like for your company and the reduction initiatives that will take you there? I think earlier on in the presentation, Kat, you talked about the 2015 Paris Agreement and how there was this public and private ascension to being net zero by 2050. A lot of the science is now telling us that 2030 is a time that we need to be thinking about in terms of urgency and ways that we can mitigate the disaster that we are looking at over the horizon. How do you decide on a timeline once you have established your baseline?
Oh, it's the greatest question. And I think the simple answer is no one confidently knows, because it's actually very difficult to be able to confidently say that you will be able to fully decarbonize, particularly your supply chain, which is not always within your control. So what's great about the Science Based Targets Initiative, which sets the framework for setting net zero targets, is that it breaks it down into short and long-term goals. So short term, I think, is in the next 5 years. What are you aiming to achieve in both scope 1 and 2, which is directly in your control? And then what are your goals around scope 3? And then the longer term targets are sort of anywhere, I think, up to 15 years beyond. So I really recommend having a look through their guidance. It ultimately comes down to, once you've got your baseline and you know where the emissions fall, what are the levers you can pull, and what is the level of investment that you can make to reduce those. Very happy to pick up that discussion offline, Helena, because it is very pertinent and not one that we could probably cover in 30 seconds.
And I think just on that point, what we see also, to your point, Kat, that depending on what business you're in and how big scope 1, 2, and 3 basically are in your organisation, you know, we're seeing organisations commit to 1 and 2, as Kat said, by 2025 or by 2027, and then their scope 3 by 2040, right? So to Kat's point, I think you don't have to commit to net zero all in one foul swoop. You can actually commit to scope 1 and 2, and then to scope 3 as a completely separate piece.
That's a great point.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you everyone for your questions. Those were very interesting for discussion. And Natalie, thank you so much for joining us today and